When do you put the lives of the few over the lives of the many? This is a question I've been interested in since my first YouTube video. There, I talked about the trolley car problem, where there's an out-of-control trolley heading towards 5 people. You can pull a lever to divert the trolley to a second line that has only 1 person on it. Do you pull the lever? That question is asking about the difference between killing and letting die. When someone chooses not to pull the lever, they typically do so because they believe that pulling the lever is killing 1 person, whereas not pulling the lever is letting 5 people die, and so they would rather let people die than kill people. That's a difference that matters to them. Most of us don't do that. And so to drill into the idea that sometimes we'll choose few over many people, I followed it up with the large man trolley problem, which is similar to the trolley problem, but this time, instead of pulling a lever to kill 1 person and save 5, now you'd have to push a large man off a bridge in front of the trolley, and then his large form would stop the trolley, saving the 5 people. On that question, most of us see an important difference. On that question, most people choose to not kill the 1 man and let the 5 people die. But in response to that video, and generally when I've been talking to people, some still indicate that they would push the large man, that at the end of the day, morality really is just a numbers game. They typically subscribe to a theory called utilitarianism, and I want to talk about that a little bit more today because it's a theory that I don't particularly enjoy. So, what is utilitarianism? Technically, utilitarianism is a fairly broad category with a lot of different schools of thought within it, so today I just want to talk about classical utilitarianism. It's a type of consequentialism, which is a theory that holds that the moral quality of an action or policy is entirely a function of its consequences or the value produced by the action or policy. Utilitarianism specifies more constraints on what that value is. It holds that positive value is happiness, negative value is unhappiness, and that we ought to maximize happiness not as individuals, but as a collective. So someone else's happiness is as important as my happiness. Someone close to me's happiness is as important as a stranger's happiness. Now, there is also an important distinction in classical utilitarianism between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. There's a lot of debate about whether the first utilitarians were in one camp or the other, so really we should treat both as part of classical utilitarianism and as alternatives to each other. So what's the difference? Act utilitarianism thinks that you ought to look to the consequences of an action themselves, whereas rule utilitarianism thinks you ought to look at the consequences of the set of rules that govern your actions. That's a pretty simple overview of what utilitarianism is. What I want to talk about today is a very common counterexample that tries to disprove utilitarianism, which is called the Sheriff Counterexample. Not a great name. I was hoping it had a name like the corrupt sheriff or the sheriff in the mob, but it doesn't. In this scenario, the idea is that there's a sheriff who can frame an innocent person, getting them executed, in order to prevent a mob from rioting and thus killing dozens of people. Should the sheriff frame the innocent person? Act utilitarianism simply says yes. 1 person dead is better than dozens of people dead, so you ought to take that action because it has lesser consequences. Rule utilitarianism says maybe. If people know about this rule, that you ought to frame 1 to save dozens, then it undermines people's faith in the justice system, which is a greater negative than the difference between killing 1 person and killing dozens of people. But in response to that, we can enhance this counterexample. We can say that the sheriff knows that it's easy to get away with framing an innocent person. Perhaps they've done it before, or know sheriffs who've done it before, and so they're reasonably certain that they won't get caught. Now the rule is, when a sheriff can do so covertly, framing 1 innocent to save dozens is a good thing to do. Under that guise, it still seems correct to enact this framing, even though our moral intuitions find this repugnant. Now, this is considered a counterexample and not a moral dilemma because no one really has any reservations about which side they should choose. It seems that our moral intuition tells us that we absolutely should not let the sheriff frame an innocent person just to appease an angry mob, even if it saves dozens of lives. But this flies in the face of utilitarianism. So an essential question then is, Can utilitarians find a way to say that the sheriff should not condemn the innocent while being consistent with classical utilitarianism? Jeffrey Kaplan is a professor of philosophy, and he makes videos on YouTube that I'd highly recommend. In his discussion of this, he points to J.J.C. Smart, who is a well-respected utilitarian, was a well-respected utilitarian. He's long dead now. And J.J.C. Smart argues that no, but utilitarianism can say that's the correct outcome. The sheriff should frame the innocent person because lots of people will die. If dozens of people are going to die, then yes, you should sacrifice the one person. Our intuition that framing an innocent is wrong is an incorrect intuition. Peter Singer is perhaps the best known utilitarian philosopher active today, and he says that there's a couple other options. First, he points out that some people get around this by saying that the situation is too unrealistic, and that our intuitions are only helpful when we're talking about a realistic scenario. And so in response to that, he specifically constructs the scenario in a historically accurate way, in a way that's certainly happened in even moderately recent American history, where he says, let's have an angry mob in the antebellum South.
So you imagine in this example that you're the sheriff in this town. The mob is about to string up half a dozen African Americans and lynch them because a white woman says that she was raped by an African American, but she can't identify the person who raped her. You are not able, you just don't have the physical capacity, you don't have any reinforcements, you're not able to compel the mob to let these people go. But there is one way in which you could persuade them to at least let 5 of them go. You could identify, you could claim that you have evidence that one of them is the person who committed the rape. In fact, you have no such evidence.
That seems to be a very realistic scenario where our moral intuitions ought to be useful, and the notion that he should frame one of them still feels wrong. It still feels bad to frame an innocent man for murder. The second option he puts forth is that you could bite the bullet in the way that J.J.C. Smart does. You could say that, well, the moral intuition is wrong, and we don't know why our moral intuition that framing an innocent person is wrong, but we like utilitarianism in enough areas that we can accept this cost. He doesn't clearly endorse this view, but all the other views he gives reasons to undermine and reasons to discount. And once again, Peter Singer is a utilitarian, so it seems like this is his view, but he doesn't explicitly endorse it. Finally, he puts forward the idea that rule utilitarians can answer this differently. He points out that one of the underlying assumptions of rule utilitarianism is that the rules are generally well known. So you can't have a rule about this not being known, because that goes against the whole point. And so the rule a utilitarian could hold to that allows them to not frame the innocent is that sheriffs should uphold the duties of their office because that creates better consequences. I think this particular approach abandons consequentialism in a meaningful way, because stipulating that your rules need to be generally understood by the public means that you are saying that the means with which you achieve ends matters. You're not allowed to have secret rules. You're not allowed to have private rules. You're not allowed to keep secrets. And so we've arrived at a form of utilitarianism that isn't utilitarian, that says the means matter, at least sometimes. And I'm not sure I can see a reason why the rules that you make being publicly understood is a means that matters, but other means don't. It seems to me that pushing a large man off a bridge might be a bad means as well, and that we ought to respect that. So I think utilitarians are left with the choice to either abandon utilitarianism or accept that framing innocent people for murder is the right thing to do from time to time. I would prefer to say that sometimes we do prioritize the lives of the few over the lives of the many, and one such example would be we don't frame innocent people, even if being extorted by angry mobs. I've been Buck, Kansas. These are some of my thoughts. I'm going to include links down below to Jeffrey Kaplan's lecture and Peter Singer's lectures so that you can see it from them and see their opinions on it. Both of them are certainly good resources on utilitarianism. So please like, share, and subscribe. It helps out a lot. Leave a comment, especially if you think I'm wrong. I do read them, and sometimes they hurt. Boy.